Well, today is our gift day, and as you might imagine, it's right to concentrate on the topic of wealth and money. But I'd like us to do that this morning with a slightly broader focus than just what we might or might not choose to give to the work of the mission and the ministry here in St. George's. I think it's really important that we recognise that our whole approach to wealth and to money is a critical part of our spiritual life. And that's what we see in our reading this morning from 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 3 to 10, that Joanne has just brought to us. And the key really to that passage is in verse 6, where Paul, who wrote it, states, "True godliness with contentment is itself great wealth." Now, in that passage, as we heard, he'd just been warning about teachers, people in the church going in, teaching things, who were doing it only out of self-interest. They were in the church, they were active in the church, they were trying to play their part in it and to teach and encourage others, but their real motive was what they could get out of it, what they could make of it, and their own financial well-being was their goal. They might not say it publicly, but that was the case. That was their motive. Now, it's helpful to contrast that with the approach that we see in the life of the Apostle Paul himself. Paul sort of summed it up when he wrote to the church at Philippi in Philippians chapter 4, verse 12. There he wrote this, he said, "I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I've learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it's with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little. But I can do everything through Christ, who gives me strength." Paul had learned to be content in every situation. Now, that wasn't just saying, I've learned to get on with it, I've learned to cope, I can put up with it. He'd learned that what was most important in whatever circumstances he faced was his relationship with Christ. That daily ongoing relationship with Christ would support him and enable him to see through all the challenges, all the difficulties he's faced. It's that relationship that even when we face hardships or difficulties, as well as the good times, sustains us. It encourages us. It gives us a peace. What we see, though, in our reading this morning is that peace, the great value that we have in Christ, can be ruined by a lack of contentment when we get dissatisfied with what we have. There's a real danger of getting sidetracked to pursuing another goal, other goals of looking after ourselves, almost like those teachers were. And if we do that, if we go off on that siding, then our relationship, that peace we can have, will be lost. And what this passage gives us this morning is really a clear choice, a choice between contentment and covetousness. Contentment and covetousness. Let's take contentment first. Now, it's important to say that this passage that Paul wrote is not talking about people in destitution. It's not talking about those who have nothing being content. You know, the old Marxist idea that religion is the opium of the people. The idea that, just focus them on there's a God and there's a heaven in the future. Don't worry about the fact you're starving in that now and it keeps the masses in thing. It's not suggesting that at all. In fact, the Christian faith is very clear and consistently teaches that we're to meet the needs of the most needy, that nobody should be in a state of destitution. That is not the situation that Paul is addressing in this passage. that he's addressing those who have enough. But of course, people could always want more. They've got enough. And what it points out in that context is a basic reality of life. And the reality of life that he points out is we start this life with nothing and we leave this life with nothing. You know, we're born with nothing. We don't bring anything with us when we're born, and we don't take anything with us when we die. Now, if we think about that, well, if that's the case, anything we possess, anything we have, is probably best thought of as luggage for the journey. It's what we gather and we carry and we have for this journey through life, because we bring nothing with us and we take nothing away with us. It's luggage. And that idea of luggage is perhaps a helpful one to hold. Deborah and I, in a couple of weeks' time, are going on holiday. We're going on holiday in this country in October. Now think about that. This country in October. It could be lovely and warm, but it could be extremely cold. It could be nice and dry, or it could be pouring with rain. We've got to decide what we could take with us. Now, we could gather things for every single eventuality. And that way we would be equipped, wouldn't we, to live for the time we're away in perfect comfort. Except we would be so bogged down, so cumbered up with what we've got to carry that it would ruin everything. Everything we have is helpfully seen as luggage for the journey. It clearly pays to be selective with what we need. God chooses us, gives us a choice to be selective. But if we carry on the luggage analogy, God doesn't work like checking your luggage into an airport. He never actually gives us a maximum. You know what I mean? When you get to the airport and you put your case on the scales, if it's too heavy, it can't fly, and that's it. Yeah? God doesn't work like that. God actually gives us the choice of how much luggage we carry. There's not a maximum, but he does expect us to make choices. Had we read on in our passage down to verse 17, we'd have read this. Paul writing about people, he says, their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment. You know, God gives us actually often more than we need. And he does it for our enjoyment. So if we have more than we absolutely need, we shouldn't feel bad about it. We shouldn't feel guilty about it. That we should be thankful for it, because that's the nature of God. He gives us more than we need. He provides the basics and more, but we need to be careful that we don't just take and take and take and gather so much luggage that it ruins the time that we have. Now let's be very practical this morning, therefore. What does our passage mean when Paul says enough food and clothing? What does it mean to have enough? Because that's actually key to the problem we're struggling with. What does it mean to have enough? And it actually can be different in different circumstances and different contexts. I remember when I first went out to India and worked out there, living on the tea estates, with the people who lived on the tea estates, in the houses on the tea estates, eating the food that the people on the tea estates ate, using the facilities in the homes that they would use. It was fairly basic, as you might imagine. And I'll never forget that feeling that many of us will have experienced coming back from a situation like that, back to the UK, of being suddenly struck by something I'd never recognised before, how wealthy we are, how comfortable life is, how good the environment is in many ways. And for a few years, that really did trouble me. what is it, the basics that we need to live? And it wasn't until a couple of years later, I was on a course with ministers, and some of us were just talking. I was talking to this minister, and I said this, and he said, and I said, but the trouble is, you can't live so simplistically in the UK. And he turned around to me and said, no, of course you can't. You can't live like that in the West. What we need, enough, can be different depending on our circumstances and where we are. Maybe the test, though, is in our circumstances and where we are. Can others live on that? Or are we seeking more? We've got a choice in this passage between contentment and covetousness, and we're called to be content. Let's think a moment about the alternative, though, covetousness. That's looking at what we don't have and seeking that. Seeing what maybe others have and thinking, I want that too. That's covetousness. Now, we are in an all-age service this morning, and I think this is something really important to say for our young people. What Paul is not doing here is he's not attempting to quell ambition. And I think it's really important to say that in an all-age service. This is not talking about a lack of ambition. And if one of our young people wants to succeed in life, that is good and proper and to be positively encouraged. So supposing one of our young people wants to become a doctor, good. If you've got the ability to do that, work hard to do it and achieve. And if that and success in that, and maybe success then in the career, gives you all the trappings of success, that is good and to be thankful for. This is not quelling ambition. Equally, if you want to be an engineer or a singer, whatever it is, that is right and proper and good and should be encouraged. The warning here is about focusing on the financial reward and nothing but. If you want to become a doctor and you become a leading doctor and a key surgeon and do extremely well, then that's great. Use that skill and ability to bless others, and you will. But if you were to do that simply because you think, if I reach the top, I will be well paid and rich, that is where the trouble is. It's when the goal is focusing on that. And there's a warning here. And the warning is given, and it says in our passage, not to do that because it is addictive. The seeking of wealth and more wealth, and that covetousness of, I've now seen something else that I don't have, and I want more, that is addictive. I think one of the saddest things I've seen whilst living here and living where I do, overlooking a car park, as many of you know, is that car park is clearly being used by those who trade drugs. And one of the saddest things I see too frequently is somebody hanging around the car park when it's going dusk. And physically, they're wasted away. They've become very thin, they look ill, and they're tapping away on their phone. And we know what they're doing. They're calling for the next delivery. And it's a sad sight to see that they're so taken by this addiction. They're on edge, they're watching around, they're physically very ill, they're malnourished because all of their money that they've got is going on feeding their habit rather than feeding themselves. And then in a few minutes, a cyclist will come up, there'll be a quick exchange, the cyclist will go on and they will go on. Dreadful example of ruined lives. And actually, Paul says here that it's addictive. He talks about falling into a trap. It's helpful, it's not just this passage speaks of it. Ecclesiastes 5 verse 10 said this, those who love money will never have enough. How meaningless to think that wealth brings true happiness. It is addictive. Jesus warned in Luke 12:15, beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own. There's a real trap, and the trap is setting wealth as your goal, because somebody who does that will never be satisfied and will always want more. I never forget seeing a television interview some years ago with, for those of us old enough to remember, the sports presenter, Dickie Davies. He used to present the Saturday sports show on independent television. And he was talking about the conversation he'd had some years before with a man who'd been a good friend of his in show business, Eric Morecambe. Now, for those of us who are really old, we will remember Morecambe and Wise. And for those of you who won't remember Morecambe and Wise, they were this country's top comedy duo on the television. You know, they were the ones whose Christmas show had an audience, television audience of 28 million people regularly. You can imagine the wealth that generated. And the conversation that Dickie Davies recounted was one Friday evening, Eric Morecambe was visiting his house. Now, Eric Morecambe had had a heart attack, a serious heart attack, a couple of years before. And the main part of the reason for that was the pressures that sort of life, that sort of show business life brings. And he was talking to Dickie Davies, and he said, you know, really, the advice would be that he should retire. And Dickie Davies said to him, said, well, why don't you? And his response was, yeah, but you can't be sure you've got enough. And Dickie Davies said he couldn't believe it. Here's the man with that sort of wealth that's generated and that sort of reserve to fall back on. You can't be sure you've got enough. It's addictive. That sort of addiction will never lead to a godly life. In fact, all too often, it's the opposite. It leads to envy. It leads to selfishness. It leads to cheating. It leads to fraud. It leads to dishonesty. In cases, it leads to robbery. In certain cases, it's even maybe known to lead to murder. People just want so much and can't imagine living without it. And even if it doesn't, it will cause the person to wander from the faith, because by the time they gain so much to feel that they would be content, they've given up on all reliance on God. They're relying totally on themselves. But as many of us know, and this passage reminds us, it doesn't lead to contentment in the end. All too often it leads to grief. And how many examples can we think of famous people who've had unimaginable amounts of money, struggling with life, struggling with a lack of contentment, struggling with an emptiness that can't be filled. And they explore all sorts of things and do themselves all sorts of harm to try and fill the hole that can't be filled. And the reality is, the only person who can fill that hole in our life is Christ. It's in him we find fullness. It's in him we find meaning. It's in him we find security. That's the danger we're called upon to avoid. We have a choice in this passage between contentment and covetousness. Yet today is our gift day. But let's make our focus broader than that, broader than what we might or might not feel that we're called to give to St. George's and the mission and the ministry here. Let's take it as a real opportunity to look at our whole of our lives, our response to wealth and money, and let's make sure we keep our focus on Christ. We find our contentment in him, because that is the way that we live a godly life.